Africa is no longer waiting. For centuries, the continent was chained to Western trade dependence, raw materials out, cheap imports in, and debts piling higher than skyscrapers. But now, something revolutionary is happening. A project so ambitious, so bold, that the West can feel its grip slipping. The African Continental Free Trade Area, AfCFTA. Some call it Africa's economic NATO. Others call it Afrinet, a vast, interconnected trade and production network that could shake the very foundations of global economics. And tonight, we read diving deep into the biggest economic showdown of the century. Economic Afrinet vs. Western trade dependence. Africa in chains. For decades, Africa has been locked into an exploitative trade model. Here's how it worked. Africa exported raw materials like cocoa, gold, oil, and cobalt. The West processed and manufactured those goods into chocolate, jewelry, cars, and smartphones. Then Africa imported those finished goods back at 10 times the price. This wasn't just bad economics. It was deliberate dependence, a neo-colonial cycle, ensuring that Africa stayed a supplier, never a producer. Even today, over 80% of Africa's exports to the EU are raw materials. The West set the rules, wrote the contracts, and cashed the profits. But a storm has been building, and it has a name. AfCFTA. The birth of Afrinet. Launched in 2021, the African Continental Free Trade Area is the largest trade pact since the creation of the World Trade Organization. It unites 54 countries, 1.4 billion people, and a combined GDP of over $3.4 trillion. But AfCFTA is more than just trade. It's about rewiring Africa's destiny. Imagine Nigerian oil refined in Ghana, Ethiopian coffee processed in Kenya, Congolese cobalt turned into African-made EV batteries in South Africa. Instead of relying on Europe or America, Africa builds an internal ecosystem, an Afrinet that makes the continent self-sufficient and globally competitive. The West sees this as a nightmare, because once Africa trades with Africa, the demand for Western imports collapses. The West's economic fear. Let us be clear. The West depends on Africa as much as Africa depends on the West. France's uranium for nuclear energy comes from Niger. Europe's cocoa addiction runs on Ghana and Ivory Coast. The tech world's lifeline cobalt comes from the Democratic Republic of Congo. If Africa develops Afrinet supply chains and refines its own resources, Europe and America face skyrocketing costs. Imagine French supermarkets without cheap African cocoa, or Silicon Valley without Congolese cobalt. The West calls AfCFTA ambitious, but behind closed doors, they call it dangerous. The power of scale. AfCFTA is not just symbolic. The numbers are staggering. It could boost intra-African trade by 52% by 2035. It could lift 30 million people out of extreme poverty. It could create a $6.7 trillion economy by 2030. For the first time, Africa is using scale as power. Individually, small economies like Malawi or Benin can compete with the West. But united, they form an economic giant, bigger than the EU, bigger than NAFTA, and second only to China in growth speed. Afrinet is not a dream. It's a reality under construction. Challenges from the West. But the West is not just sitting back. They have weapons of their own. 1. Debt traps. Piling IMF and World Bank loans on African nations to weaken their negotiating power. 2. Trade barriers. Using standards and regulations to block African exports from entering Western markets. 3. Divide and rule. Pressuring individual African leaders to break from AfCFTA and sign bilateral deals that undermine continental unity. It's the old colonial strategy, modernized. But Africa has learned the game. Afrinet's secret weapons. How does Afrinet fight back? With 3 secret weapons. 1. Youth power. 70% of Africa's population is under 30. They are tech-savvy, entrepreneurial, and tired of being exploited. They are the driving force behind fintech, e-commerce, and startups connecting markets digitally across borders. 2. Resource control. For decades, Africa exported oil and minerals raw. Now, AfCFTA is pushing policies that require local processing. No more cheap raw exports. 3. Pan-African infrastructure. Railways from Lagos to Dakar. Fiber optic cables from Cairo to Cape Town. Ports, power grids, and digital payment systems that bypass Western banks. This is the nervous system of Afrinet, the dragon and the eagle. But there's another player, China. While the West resists AfCFTA, China supports it at least on the surface. Beijing invests in infrastructure, railways, ports, and energy to connect African markets. For China, a stronger Africa means a stronger partner against Western dominance. Meanwhile, the United States tries to counter with AGOA, the African Growth and Opportunity Act. But AGOA is not partnership. It's charity. It gives Africa temporary trade access as long as it obeys Washington's rules. Afrinet doesn't want charity. It wants equality. The future. A new economic map. So, what happens if Afrinet succeeds? By 2035, Africa could be exporting not just raw materials, but finished goods. Nigerian electric cars, Kenyan pharmaceutical drugs, Ghanaian chocolate brands rivaling Swiss giants. Western economies would face a double shock, losing access to cheap African exports while competing with African-made products. This would flip the global map. For the first time since colonization, Africa wouldn't just participate in globalization, it would shape it. Afrinet vs. Western trade dependence is more than economics. It's about freedom. Every railway built, every border opened, every factory powered by African hands is a declaration. Africa will not be the world's supplier of cheap labor and raw goods forever. Africa will rise, united and independent. The West is watching nervously, because they know, once Afrinet is complete, the balance of global power will never be the same again.